Recently, it's been reported that SSD speeds on the new M2 generation of Apple Silicon laptops has been significantly slower than M1, at times up to 50% slower, which is a massive decrease in speeds. And because of how the Macs are designed in general, there's no real way to correct this other than upgrading your Mac at the time of purchase, as we'll discuss later in this video. And it doesn't just impact the SSD speed, it impacts the whole computer speeds, as we'll also discuss in this video. So let's unpack why this happens, how it impacts the experience, and whether you should stay away from the base model M2 Macs if you're going to be buying one anytime soon. So first, let's answer the question of why it happens. It's because of a component in your Mac called the NAND storage chip. It sits on the logic board. The SSD used to be a separate component inside of your laptop. However, with the redesign of M1, everything got tightly integrated into one board, with logic board, which obviously has the M2 chip, and it's obviously got the GPU, CPU, etc. Everything that you need to power the computer. With M1, the NAND chip situation was like this. So the overall storage was broken up into 128GB chunks in regards to the NAND chips. This means that if you had the base model 256GB M1 MacBook Air like I do, you'd have two NAND flash storage chips, each of 128GB. For the 512GB version, there was obviously 4, 1TB, there was 8, etc, etc, and you build on up and up. If you put it into driving terms, you'd have 2 lanes of traffic for data on the 256GB version, 4 lanes for the 512GB version, and 8 lanes for the 1TB version. This obviously means that more data can travel at faster speeds. Right, so what's the situation with M2, you may ask? Well, with M2, Apple saved on costs by only including one 256GB NAND chip for the base model 256. For the 512GB variant, which happens to be the base model storage for the new M2 MacBook Pros, there were only 2 NAND flash storage chips, each of 256GB respectively. For the 1TB version, there were only 4 chips. This is a 50% reduction across the board. In driving terms, again, you have 50% less lanes for people to travel on. Fewer chips means lower production costs, but it also means less places for the SSD to read and write from simultaneously. This reduces overall speed. It is a key thing. Say if you were editing on the internal drive on Final Cut like I do, and you were transferring files, this would be slower. However, I reckon the biggest issue with this is what happens when you have to swap memory. So you might ask, what is swap memory? Well, I'm here to answer your question. Swap memory is when, say, if you run out of available RAM on your Mac, the system swaps to using some of your SSD space to act as virtual RAM or random access memory. It creates like a partition that acts some of it as the RAM and the rest of it as the SSD. It's more common if you only have, say, 8GB of RAM, but it can happen to anyone. It has happened to me before when I was editing on Final Cut and I have 16GB of RAM. It tends to become higher if you have a lot of apps or tabs open, or apps that are running complex processes, so like if you were editing or if you were doing 3D animation. If your SSD speed is maximum 50% lower, then that RAM is going to be 50% lower. That's exactly what's going to happen. And in turn, this is going to slow down your system. The only question is, will you notice it? TLDR, from what I've seen, you probably won't notice it if you're doing non-intensive stuff. Even if you're editing on Final Cut, as long as you didn't have lots of layers and plugins and a color grade, you should be fine. However, when it comes to do the intensive stuff, like when you have all those layers and multicams, etc., then you probably will notice the impact. If you are writing or reading large files or multitasking a few large different programs, then you will start to see the impact of only having a 256GB or 512GB SSD and it being 50% lower. Right, so how would you solve the problem? Well, obviously you can't upgrade your SSD after you buy it, which is a concern. Say even if your SSD went completely fried, you would have to buy a whole new Mac, which is something that's not good in rights repair terms. The SSD is very hard to access since it's on a non-repairable part of your computer, which is the logic board. So the only way to solve it is to upgrade to a higher storage when you buy your MacBook. And this is expensive, up to $200 for one upgrade. Do I think this is right? No. Was it avoidable? Yes. Could it have meant that M2 was more expensive? Maybe. Is there anything we can really do about it at this stage? No. Unfortunately, sometimes we just have to suck it up, Buttercup. This is just one of these things that we can't really control. Again, you probably won't notice it, but if you do, then maybe you should upgrade. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.